Tom Lacroix comes before you clad in a presumption of innocence. He retains that presumption of innocence unless and until the government has proven his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt to a moral certainty. Beyond a reasonable doubt to a moral certainty, that's the burden of proof that the Commonwealth has to assume in this case, and that's what they have to sustain. And my client retains that presumption of innocence unless and until the government has proven the case beyond a reasonable doubt to a moral certainty. Now, my obligation here in this courtroom is very different from that of the prosecutor. The prosecutor has to make an opening statement and tell you what it is that she expects, and it's only an expectation, really a hope, as to what it is that she expects or hopes to prove. Commonwealth, the prosecutor has to present evidence. They have to call witnesses. They have to put in other types of evidence in an attempt to persuade you beyond a reasonable doubt to a moral certainty that my client is guilty. The Commonwealth has to carry that burden throughout this trial. I don't have to prove a thing to you. I don't have to make an opening statement. I don't have to ask a question. I don't have to present one piece of evidence. I don't have to call any witnesses. You know what? I could sit at this table next to my client and read a book during the course of this trial. And at the end of the trial, the issue that is before you would be exactly the same as it is now. Has the government proven the case to you beyond a reasonable doubt to a moral certainty? I don't have to do a thing in this trial. And you'd still have to make the decision as to whether or not they have sustained that burden of proving the case beyond a reasonable doubt to a moral certainty. Now, you can infer from the fact that I'm up speaking to you now that I'm not just going to sit there. I'm not going to read a book. I'm going to ask questions of every witness that gets up there in all likelihood, and I'd ask you to pay as careful attention to the questions and answers that I elicit on cross-examination as I know you will to the questions and answers that the witnesses give when the government presents its case. I may present evidence, reasonably expect that I will, and I'd ask you to pay careful attention to the evidence and witnesses that I present, the same as I know you will to the evidence and witnesses which the Commonwealth presents. But when I do that, I'm not doing that for the purpose of proving my client's innocence. I don't have to do that. I'm not doing it for the purpose of proving anything to you. The only reason that I speak to you, that I present evidence, that I cross-examine, or that I do anything in this courtroom is to level the playing field and to present in a fair and even light the only issue which is here for your consideration, which is, has the government proven the case beyond a reasonable doubt to a moral certainty? You'll hear evidence. You'll hear evidence in this case. You heard the prosecutors say, well, you know, to the extent that we can corroborate evidence, the testimony of the witnesses, we will. What does that mean? I'll tell you what you're not going to see. I want you to listen as carefully as you can. You're going to hear a case in which witnesses exaggerate, blow out of proportion, and frankly lie about what they saw. Perhaps because of who my client is, because he's a chief of police, and because of the way in which the case has been the focus of some publicity. Some people like attention. But I'll tell you this, I want you to focus on the objective evidence that you can see that is not tainted by any bias, that is not tainted by anyone's ill will or anger or hatred for anyone. And those two pieces of evidence are the videotape of what you're going to see at the Maynard police station when Shannon Pellicano and Andrea Lacroix entered the station on the night in question. And the hospital records are two of the objective things that you're going to see. Well, let me tell you how the evidence in the government's case appears and then disappears. Shannon Pellicano, who despises my client, says that Andrea Lacroix showed up at her house at a certain point in the evening, and that she had a bleeding lip, and that it was swollen, and that she had certain visible injuries. That's what she says. You're going to watch them, you're going to see an actual video of Shannon Pellicano and Andrea Lacroix entering the Maynard police station. And in this very vivid video, you're going to see them go into a room and sit down and have a conversation with a sergeant of police, a police sergeant, who doesn't know anybody in this case. And you'll hear evidence that when they walk in there, this supposed bleeding lip and this swollen lip suddenly disappear because the sergeant, who's experienced in investigating crimes, wrote a report and said, will say, I expect, he didn't see any bleeding lip. He didn't see any swollen lip. He didn't see any injuries at all. So that's the first time that the injuries disappeared. The second time that the injuries disappear are at the Newton Wellesley Hospital, because Claire Cohen is going to come in and claim, for whatever reason, that when she saw Andrea Lacroix, and I suggest to you it's more because she spoke with Shannon Policano, okay, and she spoke with others, and she comes in and says, oh my God, she had bruises all over her arms and legs, bruises everywhere. You're going to see the medical records. Andrea Lacroix went to the hospital. Yes, she has a bruised coccyx in her back from a fall, which she'll explain. There's no injuries to her arms, not one. There's no injuries to her face, not one. There's no injuries to her legs, not one. And the government will say, oh, pay no attention to them. Maybe they disappeared. Please. The video shows nothing. The police sergeant saw nothing. They complained of nothing. In that video, all you're going to see is Andrea Lacroix crying. And the officer, not a Band-Aid, not ice, not first aid, but some tissues, because she's crying and she's upset. And at the hospital, you'll see that the medical treatment consisted of nothing. They took x-rays of her coccyx. She has a bruised coccyx, and there are no injuries noted to anything else. They don't even put a Band-Aid on her. But the government says, oh my God, these hysterical witnesses saw all of these injuries. It must be true. He's the chief of police. The cameras are here. Yes, he must have been injured. But those injuries magically disappeared because they were never there. Why is Andrea Lacroix crying? Well, let me tell you something. Right off the bat, my client is not proud to be here. He's ashamed of the conduct that he engaged in regarding his wife, and ashamed and embarrassed, and it has made its way into this courtroom. My client, and this has happened with people who are in relationships and spouses from time immemorial, had an argument with his wife, a very bad argument. He was verbally abusive to her. He said nasty things. He accused her of cheating. He was upset, and he got drunk, something that he really, really, really is not a habit or anything that he's ever done. I suggest to you the presence of anyone that you'll hear from, and he gets very drunk that day. He sure does. And in the course of getting drunk and embarrassing himself by his conduct, he said a lot of really bad things. He screamed and yelled at his wife, and she screamed and yelled back. And they had a verbal argument, which was very upsetting to her. And so she drove to what she thought was a friend's house for some place to go and cool off on this particular evening. And you'll hear evidence that Shannon Pelicano has her own agenda in this case, because when Andrea Lacroix shows up at Shannon Pelicano's house, she just wants to talk. Her husband is drunk and upset. He was undergoing a lot of stress as the chief of police. He was having a very stressful and difficult relationship with the mayor at the time. And he felt overwhelmed by his job situation. And he wasn't prepared to handle it, and he would be the first one to admit that he should have sought help for his stress-related condition, and he didn't. And he drank too much when he got upset that day. And he verbally abused his wife, and they had an argument. But those are not crimes. For that, I will apologize on his behalf, and you will hear evidence that he certainly is sorry about that. But those are not crimes. And that's not what brings us here into this courtroom. The fact that he was drunk, and the fact that he was verbally abusive, and the fact that he did not act in an appropriate manner for a police officer, or certainly chief of police. But that's not what he's on trial for. Tom Lacroix committed no crimes.